In the northwest corner of town, the park is approximately 43 acres in size and, and is mostly a wooded area that features 2 ponds and nearly 2 miles of walking trails. It was dedicated as a passive park, symbolized this past year by the birth of 2 newly hatched green herons in the park. Its passive status is due in large part to the efforts of Noel Taylor, a science teacher at Westfield High School, who had vigorously campaigned to keep the park in its natural setting. This photograph and news story shows Noel Taylor concluding a field workshop in 1978 with other Westfield teachers and notes his impending retirement from teaching. Noel Taylor was invited back in 1980 to join former Mayor Burr Towle Jr., Recreation Commissioner Bob Duncan, Mayor Alan Chin, and at the dedication of the park. This is an aerial view of the park in 1979. Before it became a park, this area had been a neighborhood of mostly African American families, some of whom lived at the site of the future park for nearly 60 years. Their homes are highlighted in yellow in this 1954 aerial photograph. I'd like to take you back to the origins of that neighborhood in 1900, when it was called Turkey Swamp, explore with you how it became a neighborhood, describe in some general terms the residents who lived there, present a detailed story of one property and the residents who lived in it, and highlight some of the factors that I believe influenced the neighborhood's early success and its eventual decline. I'd like to start with providing you a brief historical context. In 1980, Westfield was a small village surrounded by farms and woods. Its population was 2,200 people. It also was a stop along the Central Jersey Railroad, which by then transported passengers to the Hudson River waterfront and ferry service to New York City. The train station had already become a factor in the town's growth. By 1890, the town's population had increased to 2,700 residents, and its transition from a village to suburban town had begun. By 1900, the population increased 60% to 4,300 residents, and 400 people were commuting to New York by then. The image here on the left is the 1901 Sanborn map of Westfield. Sanborn maps were used by the insurance industry to rate properties for their liability for insurance. But they're also a time capsule of change that takes place. The map on the right is 1909, showing the train station, the Central Jersey Railroad running here and running over here. The area here up in the far corner is the area that will become Brightwood Park, but in this time period is Turkey Swamp. By 1901, the town's first water and sewer mains had been installed in the downtown area. A new streetcar or trolley had connected Plainfield and Westfield, and work was underway to connect the trolley to Elizabeth. A new firehouse had been constructed on North Avenue, where it is today. The outward expansion of residential homes from the center of town is documented in the 1909 map, showing new housing developing as far north as Dudley Avenue and as far south as Grove Street. However, the area that's outlined in the upper left image is the eventual site of the park was 1 mile from the train station, yet it had already been subdivided into building lots. Some homes were already built there, and what is curious is what precipitated the subdivision of that land. One example, I think, or one explanation may well be the new trolley service between Plainfield and Westfield. Its route passed within 3 blocks of the neighborhood. The trolley enabled residents to travel long distances from home to work. Turkey Swamp was part of the Big Woods, a mostly undeveloped wooded area with small tracts of land bounded by Lawrence Avenue, Brightwood Avenue, and the border with Scotch Plains and Mountainside. Actually, Scotch Plains in those days was called Penwood Township. On the Scotch Plains side of the border, a largely African-American population already existed along Plainfield Avenue and Jerusalem Road. The community there would be home to St. John's Baptist Church in 1909, the Shady Rest Country Club in 1921, the Metropolitan Baptist Church in 1931, and the Jerseyland Colored Community Park in 1932. So these contiguous areas, one established in Scotch Plains, the other still undeveloped in Westfield, were destined to really become one community. Even the paper street listed in the subdivision maps that would be filed for the area on the Westfield side of the community extended the streets that already existed in Scotch Plains. Between 1900 and 1905, the area of Turkey Swamp was purchased and subdivided into 340 lots by at least 6 different real estate businesses or builders. Each subdivision had an attractive title such as Prospect Heights, Washington Heights, Scandia Heights, and Westfield Manor. Most lots were 25 by 100 feet in size, and each subdivision filed with the county registrar included paper streets, basically an unimproved right-of-way that connected each lot to either Prospect Street or Brightwood Avenue. Ironically, many of the realtor developers who purchased and subdivided the site were themselves either first-generation immigrants or U.S. residents who had themselves migrated from other areas of the country, just as the purchasers of the property and residents would be. For example, the mother of Clark Perrine, the subdivider of Washington Heights, was born in Ireland. William H. Anderson, the subdivider of Scandia Heights, had only arrived in New York with his wife in 1890 from Norway. His partner, Hjalmar Becker, was 23 years old and had arrived from Norway in 1902. John Davis, who subdivided the Marlborough Slopes, had migrated to Brooklyn and then to Scotch Plains from Oswego. For most of them, these subdivisions represented the next step in their carpentry trade, moving toward a real estate development. And it is likely that they would be less biased to whom they would sell lots simply because they probably had not done any of this before. Hjalmar Becker would go on to develop a thriving real estate business in Westfield and later in Point Pleasant. This is a postcard of Hjalmar Becker's real estate office in 1929, and as the property appears today, largely unchanged on the corner of Central Avenue and Grove Street. Many of the initial lot purchases along Madison Avenue and Liberty Street were purchased by Scandinavian immigrants, but African Americans were among the initial lot purchasers as well, encouraged no doubt by the proximity to the integrated community of Jerseyland and the less cost due to their distance from town, and the lack of bias perhaps in the people who were selling the property. African American churches would be formed in Jerseyland by 1909 and in Turkey Swamp by 1913. Prominent Westfield business owners also bought property there, including George Hankinson, the future owner and editor of the Westfield Leader, Arthur Tuttle, owner of Tuttle Coal and Oil, and Frederick Gray of Gray's Funeral Home. Perhaps the most significant event that solidified the attraction of Turkey Swamp to African Americans was the purchase of the Westfield Golf Club in 1921 by a group of African American investors led by Dr. Howard Brock of Westfield. The club was renamed the Shady Rest Golf and Country Club. It was not only the first African American golf club in the country, it became a social and cultural center for African Americans throughout the metropolitan area. American entertainers like Cab Calloway, Chick Webb, Ella Fitzgerald, and Sarah Vaughan made it a regular stop on their circuit, and W.E.B. Du Bois attracted a crowd of hundreds to hear him speak there in 1922. Regrettably, the growing prominence of the Shady Rest also attracted the attention of the Ku Klux Klan, whose members, dressed in white hoods and gowns and walking with torches and burning crosses, held rallies near the club over several years in the 1920s. The 1921 Sanborn map of Westfield illustrates the dramatic pace of growth in town. There were, however, growing pains. The town could not keep up with the demand for new water mains and sewers to provide homes with indoor sanitation or paved roads needed due to the proliferation of cars. None of these services had reached the Turkey Swamp neighborhood, but there was another problem concerning the provision of these services. The first water mains had been installed by the Union Water Company in 1896 near the train station. The town had entered into a franchise agreement with the water company in 1907 to provide water service throughout the town. For new mains, property owners had to demonstrate the need for a certain amount of water consumption based on the number of homes or businesses on a street. The town retained direct responsibility for existing and new sewer mains, sewage treatment, and storm drains. For new sewers, a majority of property owners on each street had to petition and agree in advance to pay an added sewer assessment on their property taxes to defray the cost of new sewer mains. That same approach was also applied to the town's assumption for grading existing dirt roads and applying a tar and chip coating, many of which I'm sure you remember. I remember those roads. The standard road surface that was adopted by Westfield for much of the 20th century. This is an example of a town ordinance adopted by the Westfield Town Council in 1922 after being petitioned by the property owners along Prospect Street to grade and pave the street. The improvements is slated to cost $5,000, which would be apportioned to the properties bordering that section of Prospect Street. While this was a common approach for New Jersey municipalities, it became a serious obstacle for Turkey Swamp neighborhood residents, which had many lots, but not many homes on them. Liberty Street, for example, had only 11 homes by 1921 among the 50 lots which bordered it. So it would be a challenge for the new homeowners to rally support among a majority of vacant lot owners and perhaps investors to pay more taxes on their lot for paved roads, water, or sewer services. The situation would preclude the residents of Turkey Swamp from upgrading their water and sewer services or pave their streets to keep pace with the new housing developments surrounding the neighborhood. This image is a composite of the 1921 Sanborn map and the 1979 aerial photograph of Brightwood Park. The dark shape in the middle is the pond that you can see in Brightwood Park today. The rectangular boxes are the property lots, and if you can see the small dark shapes in some of those boxes, those are the homes that were, and outbuildings that were in place as of 1921. By this time, a majority of lot sales at Turkey Swamp were to African American buyers, and the majority of purchasers who built homes on their lots were African Americans. About 2/3 of the 27 homes built were originally owner-occupied, and the rest were rented to mostly African Americans. All except one of the African American occupants had come north from the southern states along the Atlantic coast. They were part of the great migration of African Americans to the north, seeking a better future for themselves. According to US Census reports and obituaries, residents worked in various service occupations: peanut vendor, servant in a private home, janitor, hotel porter, gardener, barber, cook, laborer, and railroad worker. They were active in social clubs like the Elks and the Masons in Westfield and Plainfield, and many performed significant roles in support of St. Thomas AME Church on Fanwood Avenue and at Metropolitan Church and St. John's Baptist Church in Scotch Plains. Most were married, and many couples had children. At the outbreak of each war, male residents signed up for the draft, and many served. The Great Depression affected everyone in America and certainly impacted Westfield's robust growth, but it affected African Americans working in service occupations profoundly. Loss of employment was estimated to be 25% for white workers, but 50% for African Americans. The loss or reduction of work for any resident within Turkey Swamp put whole families in jeopardy for their basic needs, such as food, clothing, and shelter. There was also a notable loss of residents as the depressed economic conditions persisted. 15 residents, or about 15% of the population, either died or left Turkey Swamp during the 1930s. Among them was Virginia Bullock, who died from tuberculosis at the age of 19. She was treated at the Bonnie Burns Sanatorium, which was a precursor to Runnels Hospital. Years later, her family purchased the stained glass window at St. Luke's AME Zion Church on Downer Street in her memory. It is likely that the loss of these neighbors also contributed to the despair within the neighborhood. By 1932, 20% of mortgages in the country were in default. Banks were closed and housing construction had collapsed. In response, the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation to rescue homeowners and lenders from mortgage default. And the Federal Housing Administration was created to provide lower mortgage interest rates through federal guarantee of new mortgages. However, these programs also established written standards for loans, which included ranking neighborhoods based on wealth, home condition, sales trends, and racial composition. Both programs viewed racially integrated neighborhoods negatively. The Turkey Swamp neighborhood was evaluated in the lowest category of D, which is characterized as a hazardous area by the Homeowners Loan Corporation mapping in 1939. The D-rated neighborhoods were colored in red on the federal maps, which years later would prompt the term redlining. In the HOLC mapping of the Westfield area displayed in this image, both the Jersey Land neighborhood in Scotch Plains and the Turkey Swamp neighborhood in Westfield are included in the D category, as well as a small racially integrated section on the north side of Prospect Street. The only other area in Westfield given this ranking was the neighborhood around Kakiola Place. Each neighborhood ranking included a sheet which assessed the class of workers, the percentage of foreign-born and Negro residents, home conditions, sales trends, and provided written comment. The Turkey Swamp comment concluded by stating, in all, there are probably not over 50 or 60 structures in this area. Due to the poor type of improvements and the mixture of population, including Negroes, this is a fourth grade area, end quote. The impact of this assessment would prevent the property owners in Turkey Swamp from obtaining mortgage financing either through either of these federal programs, and it undoubtedly influenced the opinions of local officials and real estate interests about the neighborhood. By 1940, the Turkey Swamp neighborhood was surrounded by new development which had paved roads, water and sewer mains to support indoor plumbing, and whereas the 27 homes on Liberty Street, Fanwood Avenue, Netherwood Avenue, and Smith Street had rutted dirt roads for paths for roads, wells for water, and now houses for sanitation, a circumstance that continued up to the purchase of the property by the town in 1969. Perhaps the saddest irony of the difference in services to these neighborhoods is that Plainfield Union Water Company installed new water transmission mains in Netherwood Avenue in the 1940s and in Liberty Street in the 1950s, which were directly in front of many of these residents' homes, but no home service was provided to those residents. The negative ranking by federal officials and the notable difference in what were by then considered essential services likely influenced the president of the Westfield Board of Realtors to announce in 1942, quote, "The twilight zone or blighted zone of Westfield in the future must be replaced with multifamily units in this section for lower income groups. To that end, the realtors will conduct a survey and present it to the town council," end quote. The board did submit its report to the town in 1943. It included photographs of all the homes in Turkey Swamp. and proposed to replace the individual homes through rezoning the area for apartments. Future newspaper accounts confirmed that rezoning the Turkey Swamp area for apartments would be talked about by town officials and community leaders for 10 years, but the rezoning did not occur. From 1940 through 1950, the town of Westfield did conduct tax sales of delinquent properties, but it did not institute any foreclosure proceedings against property owners within the future site of the park. In fact, the town publicly sold several lots in the neighborhood that had been acquired from prior foreclosures. That practice changed in 1951, and by 1956, 99 lots within Turkey Swamp were acquired by the town via foreclosure for non-payment of taxes, and none were sold by the town. It marked the beginning of an effort by the town to assemble this part of the Big Woods for township purposes. In the 1950s, a planning consultant was hired by the town to evaluate two sites for a possible park. One was the Big Woods neighborhood of Turkey Swamp, and the other was a site east of Springfield Avenue near present-day Lenape Park. The consultant recommended the Big Woods site as it would be less costly to the town and was closer to the town's population center. Public discussion of the entire site, of the possible acquisition of the entire site, appeared in the Westfield Leader in 1961. And in 1962, the Westfield Town Council authorized the acquisition of the privately owned properties for a new park. By 1970, most private parcels had been acquired through negotiated sale. 6 parcels were acquired through condemnation, including St. Thomas AME Zion Church, the portion of the Jerseyland Colored Community Park, which was within Westfield, and several African-American homeowners who had refused to sell. 2 homeowners, Samuel Jarvis and Cordelia Miner, were granted lifetime occupancy in their homes. This is a photograph taken of Samuel Jarvis's home from the 1943 Board of Realtors report. On the left is a photograph taken in 1964 by the Courier News of Samuel Jarvis sitting on the steps of his home at 1118 Fanwood Avenue. He tells the reporter that he doesn't want to leave his home and has nowhere that he can afford to go. Samuel did sell his home to the town in 1968 for $4,000, but as I've mentioned, he was granted lifetime tenancy. He died there in 1976. Excuse me. The image on the right is the steps as they appear today in Brightwood Park, where Mr. Jarvis sat in 1964. Let me jump ahead. This is a photograph taken in 1964 by the Courier News for the same article of the lots that had been condemned by the town. And the church had purchased the lots in 1913 and had built the church and had it opened in 1917. This is a photograph of the steps that led up to the church that was recently taken. I'm going to back up a little bit now to show you 2 other slides. Cordelia Miner purchased her home on Fanwood Avenue from Yalmar Becker in 1927. This is a photograph of Cordelia Miner's home in the foreground taken in 1943 for the Board of Realtors report in town. This is a photograph of Cordelia's home taken in 1978 by Noel Taylor. She stayed in her home even after the park opened in 1980. In 1984, at the age of 97, she moved to a nursing home in Greenbrook and died the next year. I'd like to turn now to the story of one home and tell you about the persons who live there, since time doesn't permit me to talk about all the families. I'd like to share also some of my observations about how some of the other residents who live within the future site of the park. This is a photograph of 149 Liberty Street taken in 1943 as part of the Board of Realtors report to the town. When this photograph was taken, you can see the roof is partially collapsed due to a significant fire that had occurred around 1940. But it still has the outlines of a significant home with double porches on the front. William Butler purchased the land for this house from Hjalmar Becker in 1910 and built the house himself. Uncharacteristically for the neighborhood, he was single and lived there alone until 1924. William was born in Washington, D.C. in 1854. He would note years later being impacted by the White House in 1865, draped in black due to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. By 1880, William had made his way to New York City. He was hired in 1899 to be a handyman in the home of Charles Coffin, the founder and first president of the General Electric Company, and he would remain in his employ for 25 years, even after moving to Liberty Street. In 1923, at the age of 69, William established a scholarship for African American students attending Hampton Institute in Hampton, Virginia. He was found dead in his home in December of 1924. Starling Childs, the son-in-law to Charles Coffin, served as the executor to William's estate. It was valued at over $16,000 in 1925 and included stock shares in several of the subsidiary electric companies owned by General Electric. It also included $6.61, which was the balance from Williams' unused commutation ticket to New York City on the Central Jersey Railroad. His estate was used to establish two scholarships, one at Hampton Institute and one at Tuskegee Institute, one in his name and the other for needy students in both schools. This is a photograph of William taken in the January 1924 edition of the Hampton Institute's magazine, and on the right is an excerpt of his will. In the spring of 1925, a few months after William's death, Margaret Glasgow purchased William's home for $4,000. Pardon me. This is an image on the left, is a drawing of Margaret Ann Glasgow. On the right is a photograph of her second husband, Stephen Glasgow. The early life story of Margaret is similar in many respects to the African American families who purchased or rented property around Turkey Swamp. But soon after she moved to Westfield in 1925, her life took a turn that involved international travel and included the involvement of many prominent African American social activists at that time. Margaret was born in a small farm in 1882 in the Piedmont region of Virginia, about 50 miles southwest of Charlottesville. She was the youngest daughter of 6 children of Patrick and Sarah Hager. Patrick, her father, was the son of a slave owner and an enslaved mother. Margaret's mother died when she was 2 years old. Her father died when she was 17. By then, most of her siblings had already begun moving north to Washington, to Baltimore, and to New York City. Before 1900, Margaret herself also moved to Manhattan, where her 2 brothers had found work. Her brother Charles was a barber and taught Margaret barbering skills. In 1905, Margaret married Archie Patterson, who had moved north from North Carolina sometime around 1900. In 1910, they had a son, Lloyd Walton Patterson, who lived while living in the Bronx with relatives. Archie died soon after Lloyd's birth, and Margaret moved to various locations around New York and even upstate New York, taking on whatever work she could find. When her brother Charles was near death, she moved in with him to take care of him and take over his barber duties. One day in 1914, a barber named Lewis Dixon, accompanied by his driver Stephen Glasgow, came to the shop and was so impressed by her that he asked her to join him in his shop in Poughkeepsie. So Margaret and Lloyd moved to Poughkeepsie in 1914. Mr. Dixon's instincts were confirmed by an article in the Poughkeepsie Eagle News in June of 1915. The article reads in part, "Men who have been accustomed to go without a shave for a week and without haircuts for a month are flocking daily to Lewis Dixon's barbershop at 469 Main Street. And it's all because Miss Margaret Patterson of New York is presiding over the first chair." So life was improving for Margaret. She joined the AME Zion Church in Poughkeepsie. She established a relationship with Stephen Glasgow, the driver who she first met in New York, who was also an active member of the AME Zion Church there. And they married on Christmas Eve, 1917, a few days before Stephen shipped out for active duty in World War I. After basic training, Stephen was sent to France, where he was assigned to the 369th Infantry Regiment, an all-African-American unit, commonly referred to as the Harlem Hellfighters. The 369th spent 191 days in forward trench positions, more than any other American unit. After the war ended, Stephen's regiment returned home in February of 1919, and Stephen was honorably discharged, but suffering from exposure to poison gas during his time in the trenches. Stephen reunited with Margaret and his stepson Lloyd at their home in Poughkeepsie. Over time, Stephen's health deteriorated, and Margaret was advised that Stephen needed to move to an area that had better air quality. In the spring of 1925, she purchased Williams' home. Sadly, Stephen died 3 months later, leaving Margaret once again alone to fend for herself and Lloyd, now 15 years old. Margaret had difficulty finding work as a barber in her new town. To make ends meet, she became a laundress and took in boarders. She also joined St. Thomas AME Zion Church, located just around the corner on Fanwood Avenue. And in September, Lloyd enrolled in Westfield High School. However, in 1926, Margaret was contacted by the high school that Lloyd was doing poorly in school and may have to repeat his grade. She writes in her autobiography that she mortgaged her home on Liberty Street to send Lloyd to Hampton Institute, an African-American school in Hampton, Virginia. However, I speculate that Lloyd's selection of Hampton Institute may have been influenced by Mr. Butler's scholarship. Lloyd returned to Westfield in 1931 and reportedly found difficulty in finding steady work as well. In 1932, Margaret was active in her church and in the greater community of Westfield. She participated in food nutrition classes at St. Luke's on Downer Street. She was installed as the president of the Westfield Progressive Club, organized with her neighbors for the uplift and advancement of colored people of Union County. In that year, Lloyd Patterson saw an ad in a New York newspaper that attracted his attention. A Russian film company was seeking African-American actors to travel to Russia and make a film entitled Black and White. He applied and was accepted to join 20 other African-Americans who set sail on the SS Europa bound for Helsinki in the spring of 1932. This is a photograph of the cast of Black and White on board the SS Europa. Lloyd Patterson is in the fourth row, fourth from the left, and directly below him is Langston Hughes, who for a time lived in Westfield. The woman seated to the left of the ship's life ring is Louise Thompson, who was a former instructor at Hampton Institute and would later serve as the typist for Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston's attempted collaboration in Westfield. Louise and Langston had first met at Hampton Institute in 1927, the same time period that Lloyd was attending school there. Langston encouraged Louise to move to New York, so when Louise was hired in 1932 to recruit and select actors for the film, she called upon Langston to lend his support for the project, and he did. This is a photograph of Langston Hughes, and below is the house as it appears today, not today, but as it appeared on Downer Street in the 1920s. If you might note, the Westfield Historic Commission just recently designated a historic site to prevent it from being demolished. It strikes me as a little more than coincidental that Langston Hughes lived in Westfield at the same time that Lloyd Patterson did and was working with Louise Thompson during that time, and that Louise had been an instructor at Hampton Institute in the same years that Lloyd attended school there. However, in both her and Langston Hughes' writing about this time period, there's no evidence confirming connection between Lloyd, Langston Hughes, and Louise Thompson prior to this trip. Upon arriving in Russia, the entourage was greeted with great fanfare, housed in one of Moscow's best hotels, and introduced at elaborate parties to Russia's elite. However, it soon became clear that the original screenplay, meant to portray racism and class war between capitalist white owners and black workers in a steel factory in Birmingham, Alabama, was a hopeless caricature of life in the southern states. Langston Hughes was engaged to rewrite the original screenplay. Weeks passed, and eventually the Communist Party organizers of the film decided to cancel the production, allegedly after pressure from US trade representatives. The actors were offered the option of a free tour of Eastern Russia, transportation home to the United States, or the opportunity to stay. 3 in the entourage, including Lloyd Patterson, chose to stay and took up residence in Moscow. Less than a year later, he had married Ukrainian artist Vera Arilova, and they had their first of 3 sons, James Lodoyevich Patterson. In a letter to his mother in 1933, Lloyd writes, quote, "Mother, life out here is simply bubbling over like water in a tea kettle. There is so much work here that there is a lack of workers. They didn't even notice that I am black here. Leave everything and come to the Soviet Union," end quotes. This image is of 2 letters to Lloyd, one from his mother Margaret, who writes in part, quote, "Son, you tell me that Vera is such a wonderful mother and wife. I love and my heart swells within me when I think of what a wonderful husband and father you are. God bless my children, Lloyd. Find out how much it will cost and the best way for me to come," end quote. The second is an excerpt of a letter from Langston Hughes to Pat, Hughes' nickname for Lloyd Patterson. He writes, "Give my love and greetings to Vera and write me all about little Pat, Jr., or is that his name? All good wishes, Langston." He adds, "I think Vera's one of the grandest girls I've ever met. I know you do too." A year later, Margaret answers her son's invitation and travels to visit her son, her new family, and this promised land. This is a 1934 photograph of Margaret and her grandson, James Lodoyevich Patterson. This is a photograph of Lloyd Patterson holding his son a few years later. Margaret stayed with her son for 6 months, but eventually sought and found work as an electric winder at the Stalin automobile factory. She wrote an article entitled "I'm Among My Own People in My Own Country," which appeared in the 1935 edition of the Negro Worker, a publication produced by the Communist International Party. In it, Margaret states how difficult life in the United States was for her and extols how good life in Russia has been. She concludes, I now feel at home. I know the comrades, the factory, Moscow, and the whole country. I am beginning to live." However, in October of 1937, Margaret returned to the United States, arriving by boat to New York City. It is not known what prompted her return. I speculate that the Great Purge instigated by Joseph Stalin and the disappearance in 1936 of Lovett Ford Whiteman, an African-American expatriate and avowed communist who had lived in Moscow for many years and had been an advisor on the film Black and White, may have changed Margaret's outlook on her newly adopted country. It is also not known whether or not she returned at all to her home on Liberty Street. In 1941, Margaret, at the age of 59, married Samuel Banks in Charlottesville, Virginia, and lived with him in Rockland, a few miles away from her family home in Massey's Mill, Virginia. Lloyd Patterson died in 1932 from injuries sustained during the German bombing of Moscow. Margaret died a couple of years later at the age of 62 and was buried next to her father's grave in Massey's Mill. Her home at 149 Liberty Street was foreclosed by the town, in 1946 for non-payment of taxes. I'd like to note some observations about my research into the families that lived on the future site of Brightwood. One, how did the families make their way to Jerseyland and the Big Woods? And two, how the residents formed bonds between each other. One explanation on how people learned about Turkey Swamp was via newspapers. These newspaper excerpts, this is a photograph of the area of Turkey Swamp looking towards Netherwood, what would be Netherwood Avenue. Samuel Jarvis's sister lived in the house that's in the foreground at that time in the 1940s. These newspaper excerpts illustrate the African-American social life and church life in Westfield and elsewhere was captured by at least two New York newspapers, the New York Age and the Amsterdam News, which were focused on African-American life in the metropolitan New York area. Both newspapers devoted coverage to towns that had African-American residents, and each edition would publish multiple stories in one or two sentences covering events, people visiting, people traveling, and people celebrating, and church doings. I've excerpted these three articles due to limited space. The first article is from the New York Age in January of 1918, which is reporting on the wedding of Margaret Patterson to Stephen Glasgow in 1917. The article in the center is from the Amsterdam News of June of 1927, and notes that 5 Negroes, the largest in school history, graduated from Westfield High School this year. Also mentioned are visitors coming to stay with Dr. and Mrs. Howard Brock. The third article, also from the New York Age, mentions Mr. and Mrs. William Ross entertaining visitors at the Shady Rest Country Club and celebrating Decoration Day there. The second part highlights the past services on Sunday at St. Luke's AME Zion Church, where Reverend Clement Gabriel led an old-fashioned general class. A second means of spreading news of Turkey Swamp was through word of mouth, and most famously provided by the Pullman porters and conductors of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who guided migrating African Americans where to eat, where to stay, and where to find work. These two homes on Netherwood Avenue were across the street from each other. Leonard Weber was a porter at Pennsylvania Station in New York City and lived on West 63rd Street in New York in 1905. He married Anna Weber in 1913 in New York, and they bought this house on Netherwood Avenue in 1915. While their marriage apparently ended after a few years and Leonard moved back to New York, he influenced other New Yorkers to move to Westfield, including Julia Boss and her first husband, Morris Brown, who moved to Netherwood Avenue from New York. Julia's nephew, Clarence, was also a porter at Pennsylvania Station in New York. When Julia's husband, Morris, died, it was less than 1 year later that she married Moses Hines, who at that time was living and working in the brickyards in Haverstraw, New York. It's my speculation, but I think Moses Hines and the two other brickyard workers who bought properties on Netherwood Avenue in 1919 were led there by contact with the railroad word of mouth. I think the residents of Turkey Swamp were no different than the other residents in town where African American families settled. In fact, many residents of Turkey Swamp also lived in Jerseyland on Spring Street, along the streets neighboring South Avenue and South Broad Street, and in Kakiola Place. The Bullock family, for example, started living in Plainfield Avenue and Scotch Plains in 1915. Then they moved to West Broad Street in 1919, then to New York Avenue in 1920, and then to Netherwood Avenue and Turkey Swamp. Martha Bullock worshipped at St. Luke's. When her husband, Hunter, retired, he became the custodian of St. Luke's. Other families moved between neighborhoods, including the Briggs family, the Burton family, and the children of the Hurling family. What also solidified the bonds among the African American residents throughout Westfield were the churches in Westfield and Scotch Plains, and the social clubs in Westfield and Plainfield. I show this slide on Spring Street, which is now Watterson Place, I think, where the First Aid Squad is. Excuse me for a minute. To show the house of Clem and Susan Gambrell, who lived literally 2 doors away from where Reverend William Robeson and Paul Robeson would move to in 1909. And what's even more notable is that Clem Gambrell conducted services in his home before Reverend Robeson built St. Luke's AME Zion Church. When Clem's wife Susan died in 1919, he moved in with neighbors on Spring Street, but within a few years he remarried, and he and his new wife Lula moved to 1071 Fanwood Avenue in Turkey Swamp. He still conducted services at St. Luke's, but also at St. Thomas AME Zion Church on Fanwood Avenue. So many residents in Turkey Swamp were leaders in their church, whether it was St. Thomas, St. John's, or Metropolitan Church in Scotch Plains. And they looked out for each other. My best example brings me back to Cordelia Manair, who had her lifetime tenancy in her home on Fanwood Avenue. In 1952, Julia Hines, who I mentioned earlier, died, and Moses was alone. 2 years later, Moses was struck by a car while walking on Brightwood Avenue and was seriously injured. When he died in 1962, Moses Hines' given address was Cordelia's home. So she had taken him in and cared for him for 8 years before his death. The stories of the people that lived in Turkey Swamp all share a common aspiration that I think we all have. They came to Westfield to find a better opportunity for themselves and to provide a better future for their family. They came filled with hope and expectation that started with a new beginning at Turkey Swamp. Unfortunately, for most of them, it ended in frustration and disappointment. Today, when you visit Brightwood Park, you can see here and there the remnants of the homes and church that were once there. I think they are silent reminders of a troubling part of our town's history. Thank you. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have or comments you might have. You're all well rested.
The Turkey Swamp, how did that name come about?
It was actually called Turkey Swamp in property deeds going back to the 19th century. So I don't know how it got that name, but it was colloquially the name for the area. And essentially where the pond is today, if you go to Brightwood, is more or less the outline of what was the pond. Noel Taylor noted that when they excavated for the pond, they had to remove 10 feet of peat to get to a surface that would support the pond that was going to be placed there. Yes?
Rob, are there any efforts to preserve any of the remnants of the buildings there?
Not officially, and there isn't much left of most of the buildings. There are foundations that were concrete or brick and stone and mortar, but that's about it. Yes?
Do you know much about the life of Paul Robeson in Westfield?
Not from this research, but he was here. He went to high school here. He was a champion football player here. Went on to Rutgers. And he also visited Russia and also became good friends with Lloyd Patterson during his visits to Russia. Yes?
Hi, I'm Mark Braxton, and I used to live on Windsor Avenue. Was there a transition with the Turkey Swamp and perhaps the Westfield realtors of the GI Bill that Windsor Avenue was evolved? Because my history shows that a lot of the people who lived on Windsor Avenue were veterans, and they, were able to pay their mortgages with the GI Bill. And I understand the Westfield Elks was part of that process in helping develop, that transition of people moving to Windsor Avenue.
Yes, the apartments that were built there were sponsored through the neighborhood center there. I just have to say, one of the news articles that I cited today also mentioned Neil Braxton in the news in the New York Age. So if he is an ancestor, I thought that would be notable for you. A lot of the talk about building apartments was all motivated by the returning veterans from World War II not being expected to be able to afford the rents that were in Westfield. So there was multiple proposals to build housing for veterans, although there was housing for Negro veterans determined to be where Brightwood Park is today, and other areas of the town that were set up for non-Negro veterans. But that never happened to my knowledge.
You just explained on how the African Americans went to the Turkey Swamp area. And the Downer and Kakiola, how did that, you mentioned that a few times. What was the significance of those areas?
Well, I think that what happened at Brightwood didn't happen at Kakiola or on Downer Street, and in fact, those neighborhoods prospered, particularly the areas around St. Luke's, became what was called by the association here as the Black Professional Zone. That's where Dr. Brock was living. That's where many notable business people lived and also conducted businesses there. So they didn't have, and they also had paved roads and they had water and sewer. I think a better example to do as a comparison is the Kramer Park neighborhood in Scotch Plains, which was also developed primarily by Russian businessmen in New York to be home lots for African Americans. In the late 1960s and 70s, Scotch Plains was going through a process of deciding whether or not to conduct a redevelopment of that area. And the neighbors rose together in opposition to that and convinced the town not to, and it remained an integrated neighborhood that is now celebrated by picnics every year by people who actually come back, who used to live there. It's become so popular. Also of note, one of the residents who lived on Fanwood Avenue, when they lost their home to the town, moved to Kramer Park and lived out their years there. So there are differences in how different communities addressed the areas that were low income.
Yeah, about the Shady Rest, it's still there?
Yes.
And you can visit it, it's a museum?
Yes, yes. The town renamed it back to the Shady Rest 3 years ago, and they have a permanent display there about the Shady Rest Country Club, but also featuring people who lived in the Scotch Plains, Jerseyland community, very active group of people there.
Can you just go in there? You have to make an appointment?
You have to make an appointment. The best time, it's easier to go when Union County has its 4 seasons, 4 generations of history, or 4 centuries of history, in October, I think. And that is usually open, and they have everything out on display at that time. John, did you have any, no? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone, I appreciate you coming.